The 1963 United States 1-cent coin, struck at the Denver Mint and bearing the familiar D Mint mark just beneath the date on the obverse, belongs to one of the final chapters of the classic bronze Lincoln cent era that had been in place since 1909, an alloy and a design that served as a quiet witness to American life for more than half a century. This particular year, 1963, sits at an interesting crossroads of U.S. history, numismatic tradition, and national sentiment because it was minted during the last full year of President John F. Kennedy's life, at a time when the country was humming with post-war confidence, building highways, watching the space race heat up, and drifting toward the cultural changes that would erupt later in the decade. The coin itself still carried the enduring portrait of Abraham Lincoln, designed in 1909 by Victor David Brenner to mark the centennial of Lincoln's birth. His thoughtful, slightly angled profile paired with the simple, dignified inscriptions "Liberty" and "I in God We Trust," along with the date and mint mark, forming an obverse design that had already become one of the most recognized portraits in American coinage. On the reverse, the coin still featured the wheat ears design, two stylized sheaves, curving inward around the words 1 cent and United States of America, with E pluribus unum above, an agricultural, early 20th century symbol chosen to honor America's agrarian roots and Lincoln's personal background, a design that would end only the following year in 1958 when the memorial reverse took over. But 1963 kept the wheat motif alive one last time before the big shift to the memorial cent in 1959. The alloy of the 1963 cent, 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc, gives the coin that rich, warm, reddish tone collectors often call red or red-brown, depending on oxidation, and at the moment of striking it symbolized the continuation of a metal composition that had been used on most Lincoln cents since 1909. Except for the Warrior steel cents of 1943. Copper at the time was still cheap enough for the mint to use freely, although rising metal prices in later decades would eventually force major changes. The Denver Mint in 1963 was a powerhouse of U.S. coin production, and it turned out an enormous number of these cents, over 1.7 billion, making it one of the highest mintage wheat design Lincoln cents ever struck, which explains why the coin is common today in circulated grades but still admired by collectors who love the late Bronze period or who enjoy building date and mint mark sets of pre-1982 copper cents. In hand, most circulated 1963 cents show the expected signs of age, softened wheat lines on the reverse, some flattening of Lincoln's cheek and jaw, and a darkening of the copper surface toward chocolate brown. But attractive uncirculated examples with full red luster still pop up in rolls and old collections, glowing with that fiery, almost glossy mint brilliance characteristic of early 1960s Denver strikes. Historically, the year 1963 also gives these coins a subtle, emotional weight. Lincoln himself represented unity, resilience, and moral purpose, and the country in 1963 was unknowingly only months away from tragedy in Dallas, so a humble 1963 cent becomes a quiet time capsule of an America on the edge of dramatic change. If you look at the minting quality, Denver in this period was known for strong, crisp strikes compared with some Philadelphia issues, and the 1963 cent often shows sharper wheat lines and cleaner lettering, making high-grade specimens particularly appealing. Even so, strike weakness is not unheard of, especially around Lincoln's coat and the central reverse. The coin has its share of minor varieties, most famously small die cracks, occasional doubled die obverse or reverses, repunched mint marks, and die chips that collectors enjoy hunting for in bulk rolls. But no major, headline-level variety dominates the year, making it a stable, well-documented issue within the long-running Lincoln cent series. As a collectible today, the 1963 cent is beloved not because it is rare, but because it captures a blend of nostalgia, copper-era charm, and mid-century mint history. It is a coin anyone can afford, but one that rewards deeper study, especially when you consider the design story behind Brenner's portrait, the mint's transition from wheat ears to the Lincoln Memorial a few years earlier, and copper's long symbolic connection to American cents since the very first large cents of 1793. For new collectors, it is often an early addition to a folder, and for longtime numismatists, it often becomes a reference point, a reminder of the high mintage, high copper final stretch before the big changes of the 1970s and 1980s. Its place in U.S. coinage is secure as a dependable, accessible, warmly familiar representative of the classic Lincoln cent lineage. Even though more than 60 years have passed, seeing a bright red 1963, D penny feels like finding a tiny spark of American mid-century history preserved in metal. Its copper surface holding decades of stories, its wheat ear reverse representing a design that once defined a nation's smallest coin, and its portrait of Lincoln continuing to whisper the quiet dignity of one of the most important figures in U.S. history. Next, top 2. The 1968 D United States 1-cent coin, commonly known as the 1968 D Lincoln Memorial Penny, sits at an interesting crossroads in the long-running history of American small-denomination coinage, representing both a continuation of tradition and a silent witness to the shifting cultural, political, and economic climate of the late 1960s, an era dominated by social change, the Cold War, and a transforming American identity. The coin itself, struck at the Denver Mint, is identified by the small d mint mark that appears just below the date on the obverse, a detail reinstated only a few years earlier after mint marks had been temporarily removed during the mid-1960s coin shortage, making it symbolically important for collectors who track the evolution of minting policies. On the obverse, the familiar portrait of Abraham Lincoln, designed by Victor David Brenner in 1909 for the centennial of Lincoln's birth, remains crisp and iconic, representing one of the longest-running obverse designs in U.S. coinage. Brenner's initials VB, once controversial in 1909 for being too large, appear subtly on the rim of Lincoln's shoulder, a quiet reminder of numismatic history. The inscriptions, "In God We Trust," arch above Lincoln's head, "Liberty rests to the left," and the 1968 date to the right, all part of the standard Lincoln cent layout that Americans had grown used to for decades, giving the coin a familiar, comforting appearance. The coin's reverse, introduced in 1959 to mark the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, showcases the Lincoln Memorial, designed by Frank Gasparo, a structure chosen not only for its architectural beauty but its deep symbolic value. A temple-like monument to a president remembered for unity, emancipation, and leadership during the Civil War. And in one of the design's most charming quirks, if you look closely at the center of the memorial between the columns on a well-struck example, you can actually see the tiny, miniature statue of Lincoln seated inside, the only U.S. coin design where a president appears on both sides of the coin. Surrounding the memorial are the inscriptions, "United States of America," "E Pluribus Unum," and 1 cent, all arranged in a clean, classical layout typical of mid-20th century American design work. The coin itself is made from the pre-1982 copper alloy, 95% copper and 5% zinc, giving it a warm reddish-brown tone that ages beautifully over time, slowly shifting to chocolate brown or deep mahogany depending on circulation, storage, and oxidation. With an enormous mintage of 2.98 billion pieces, the 1968 D penny was produced for the everyday pockets of Americans rather than for rarity, yet even common coins carry meaning. This penny circulated through a country dealing with the Vietnam War, civil rights movements, the assassinations of Dr. King and Robert F. Kennedy earlier in the decade, and the space race that would soon land astronauts on the moon. In numismatic terms, most 1968 D cents found today have lived hard lives, scratches, dulling, and wear are common, but there are still attractive uncirculated examples in the hands of collectors, especially since Denver tended to produce coins with sharper strikes than the Philadelphia Mint at the time. Errors and varieties add extra spice for collectors. Off-center strikes, die cracks, die clashes, and BIE varieties, where a die crack forms a tiny extra line between the B and E of Liberty, are among the most sought-after fun finds, and some high-grade examples can command premium value, especially those certified MS 65 to MS 67 red, where the coin still glows with its original copper brightness. As for historical context, the coin stands as a physical reminder of a long economic tradition. Despite inflation, national growth, and changes in American society, the 1-cent coin kept its 1909 design for decades, and in 1968 it still cost the government less than 1 cent to produce, something that would no longer be true in later years when rising copper prices forced the 1982 composition change. The Denver Mint itself was operating at high capacity during this period, supporting the nation's coin needs amid rising commerce. This makes the 1968 D penny part of one of the major decades of industrial minting, when modern machinery and mass production were transforming how quickly coins could be produced. In the end, the 1968 D. Lincoln cent is not just a small copper coin. It's a piece of mid-century Americana, a tiny time capsule from a turbulent but formative era in U.S. history, a coin that millions of people handled every day, slipping across diner counters, bus fare boxes, factory paychecks, soldiers' pockets, and schoolchildren's piggy banks. Even today, holding one invites you to reflect on how far the modern world has come and how these humble cents quietly document the story of everyday life in the United States. Next, top 3. The 1976 D. Lincoln Memorial Cent, struck in Denver at the height of America's bicentennial celebrations, carries with it a surprisingly deep slice of United States history. Even though it looks like an ordinary copper penny most people toss into pockets and jars without a second thought. At its heart, this coin belongs to the long-running Lincoln cent series that began in 1909 to honor the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth, making it one of the most familiar, longest-lasting, and symbolically powerful coin designs in American history. By 1976, the country was in a patriotic frenzy celebrating 200 years since the Declaration of Independence, and although the cent was the only denomination that did not receive a special bicentennial design, unlike the quarter, half dollar, and dollar, it still circulated through a nation reflecting on its past, proud of its heroes, and embracing modern identity. The obverse front features the classic Victor David Brenner portrait of Abraham Lincoln, a design unchanged since 1909, showing the 16th president in right-facing profile with his calm, steady expression that symbolizes unity and perseverance. Around him appears the word liberty to the left, the date 1976 to the right, and just below that the small D mint mark, confirming it was minted in Denver, Colorado, one of the most productive branches of the U.S. Mint at the time. Above Lincoln arcs the motto, "In God We Trust," a phrase that had become more culturally important during the Cold War era when American identity was strongly tied to national values. On the reverse back of the coin, you'll find the iconic Lincoln Memorial design by sculptor Frank Gasparo, introduced in 1959 to mark the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birth. Remarkably, if you look closely at the center of the memorial's interior, you can even see a tiny outline of Lincoln's statue, a clever miniature within a miniature. The inscriptions "United States of America" and "Eg Pluribus Unum," out of many one, stretch along the top, and the denomination 1 cent sits boldly at the bottom, reflecting the straightforward honesty of American coinage design during the mid-20th century. The coin itself is made of 95% copper and 5% zinc, the same composition used from 1962 through 1982, giving these older cents their warm reddish color and heavier feel compared to the modern copper-plated zinc cents introduced in 1982. In terms of production, 1976 was a massive year for the mint, as Denver produced over 4.2 billion pennies. Yes, billions, because the U.S. economy relied heavily on small denomination coins for everyday transactions such as vending machines, public telephones, transit tokens, and small store purchases. That incredibly high mintage means that the 1976 D penny is common in circulation, and most examples are worth only face value unless they are in pristine, uncirculated condition. Collectors often look for sharp details, full original red luster, RD grade, and minimal contact marks. In mint-state grades like MS-65 or MS-66, these coins can carry a small premium because they're tough to find perfectly preserved after nearly 50 years of pocket wear, humidity exposure, and casual handling. Additionally, error collectors sometimes hunt for unusual 1976 D cents, such as off-center strikes, double dies, die cracks, or coins struck on defective or foreign planchets, although these are rare and must be authenticated. Still, even without rare errors, the coin's historical charm lies in its place in the bicentennial year. While other denominations showed temporary anniversary designs, the humble penny stayed loyal to the Lincoln Memorial image, almost like a silent reminder of continuity. It circulated during a time when America was transitioning from the Vietnam era, embracing new technologies, exploring space, and reshaping culture through music, television, and innovation. Every 1976, D penny is a tiny metal witness to that moment, a year of fireworks, flags, museums, and national reflection. And despite its overwhelming mintage, each coin represents a link between everyday life and larger American identity. For many collectors, holding a bright 1976 D-cent triggers nostalgic memories of childhood savings jars, school lunch lines, early video arcade machines, or the feeling of a copper penny warming in your palm under the summer sun. Even today, finding a clean, shiny 1976 D in pocket change feels like spotting a little time capsule hiding among newer zinc cents. So although it may be common, it carries rich historical weight, artistic legacy, and a subtle bicentennial spirit, making the 1976 D 1-cent piece an underrated but meaningful chapter in the long, evolving journey of U.S. numismatic history. Next, top 4. The United States 1977 D. Lincoln Memorial 1-cent coin sits right in the heart of the classic Lincoln cent era that stretched from 1959 to 2008, a period defined by its iconic reverse showing the Lincoln Memorial, and its obverse continuing the tradition of honoring President Abraham Lincoln ever since the wheat cent series began in 1909. Struck at the Denver Mint, the small D mint mark just below the date identifies its birthplace, and Denver's presses in 1977 were busy, extremely busy, turning out more than 4.149 billion cents, a number so massive that it's almost hard to visualize, but it reflects the United States' inflation-heavy economy of the late 1970s, when coins cycled heavily through circulation and were replaced at rapid speed. At this point in history, the U.S. Mint was still producing 1-cent coins from the long-time bronze alloy, 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc, which gave the 1977 D cent its rich reddish-brown color and made these earlier cents more metal valuable than the post-1982 copper-plated zinc pennies that would follow. Each 1977 D cent weighs 3.11 grams, measures 19.05 millimeters, and carries smooth, plain edges like all Lincoln cents. On the obverse, the engraving of Abraham Lincoln, created by Victor David Brenner way back in 1909 and still used in 1977, shows the profile of a confident yet solemn Lincoln facing right, accompanied by the inscriptions Liberty and I in God We Trust, both unchanged since the series began. The Denver Mint mark D sits tucked beneath the date, a subtle but essential identifier in the vast world of U.S. coinage. On the reverse, Frank Gasparo's Lincoln Memorial design, introduced for the 1959 centennial of Lincoln's birth, is a masterclass in miniature detail. With magnification, you can actually see the tiny seated figure of Lincoln inside the monument, a design choice that symbolized unity, remembrance, and America's reverence for Lincoln's legacy. Above the memorial sit the bold, spreading words United States of America, and below, the coin proudly carries its denomination 1 cent, reminding you that despite its tiny size, its identity is unmistakable. The year 1977 in U.S. history was a time of political shift, economic challenge, and cultural transformation. Jimmy Carter had just taken office, inflation was climbing, and the U.S. Mint found itself responding to heavy national demand for small denomination coinage as prices rose and coins changed hands rapidly. These factors contributed to the enormous mintage numbers at Denver that year, which is why the 1977 D is common in circulation today and not considered rare in average worn condition. Still, collectors appreciate it for what it is. A snapshot of the final decade of the real copper era of U.S. cents, making it more desirable than modern zinc pennies. Most circulated 1977 D cents are valued at 1 to 5 cents, but sharply struck, glossy red, uncirculated examples, graded MS 65 to MS 67, climb to a few dollars or even higher, depending on eye appeal. Top-tier gems graded MS 67 plus by major grading companies can command premium collector interest because finding a flawless penny among billions is never easy. Error collectors also keep an eye out for interesting varieties from this year, such as off-center strikes, die cracks, or the occasional misaligned die. While not extremely common, they do exist and can add charm and value. The coin's composition makes it particularly nostalgic. Because it's made mostly of solid copper, the piece feels denser, older, more historic than modern cents, and for many collectors, coins like the 1977 D bring back memories of rummaging through childhood piggy banks or pocket change in the pre-digital, pre-zinc era. The Lincoln Memorial Reverse, which lasted from 1959 through 2008, represents one of the longest-running coin designs in American history, and the 1977 D stands right in the middle of that legacy. Today, this penny isn't just a piece of currency. It's a tiny copper time capsule representing 1970s America, the Denver Mint's industrial muscle, and the enduring presence of Abraham Lincoln in U.S. coinage. Its widespread availability means anyone can collect it, but its historical and numismatic story gives it a richness far beyond its face value, making the 1977 D-cent a beloved little survivor of a very busy chapter of American minting history. Next, top 5. The 1978 D. Lincoln Memorial Cent, struck at the Denver Mint, sits right in the heart of the late 1970s era when the United States was navigating economic turbulence, rising inflation, and growing pressure on the U.S. Mint to maintain low-cost coin production while still satisfying enormous national demand for pennies. This coin, made of the long-running 95% copper and 5% zinc alloy, represents one of the final chapters of the true copper-era Lincoln cents before the 1982 transition to copper-plated zinc, and every 1978 D-cent you hold is literally a small piece of a disappearing era of solid copper pennies, weighing 3.11 grams, measuring 19.05 millimeters, with the familiar reeded-less plain edge and the warm red-brown tones that age slowly into darker chocolate hues. On the obverse, you've got the enduring portrait of Abraham Lincoln sculpted by Victor David Brenner, introduced in 1909 and still one of the longest-running designs in U.S. coinage history. By 1978, the bust had already been on circulating coins for nearly 7 decades, becoming an everyday icon recognized by every American schoolchild, shopkeeper, and collector, and the small d. Mint mark tucked beneath the date signified a minting operation that was working overtime, producing well over 4.28 billion pennies in Denver alone that year, helping supply a national economy booming in transaction volume. Flip the coin over, and you get the crisp architectural image of the Lincoln Memorial, designed by Frank Gasparo and introduced in 1959 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birth. Unlike the earlier wheat cent reverse, this design placed a tiny but fully detailed statue of Lincoln at the center of the memorial between the columns, marking one of the few U.S. coins to show the same historical figure on both sides simultaneously, and the reverse encapsulated America's mid-century aesthetic, strong lines, national symbolism, and a message of democratic permanence. Collectors look at the 1978 D penny as a high-mintage, common workhorse coin, but it's still full of nuance. The way the dies were wearing down from extreme production stress, the occasional minor die cracks or filled digit errors that show up in circulation, the striking differences between freshly minted red specimens and well-traveled brown survivors, and the fact that high-grade examples are surprisingly hard to find because people weren't saving modern pennies in rolls back then. In mint state condition, particularly MS 67 RD or better, the coin becomes genuinely scarce, and that scarcity gives it a special subniche within Lincoln Memorial cent collecting. Meanwhile, circulated examples carry the everyday, honest wear of late Cold War America, passing through gas stations, grocery stores, school cafeterias, and payphones during a time when a penny still had purchasing power and people actually cared about their change. Historically, this coin comes from a moment just before major transformations in U.S. currency composition, inflation policy, and coin production economics. It represents the classic copper penny's twilight period, reflecting both the mint's traditional methods and the looming shift toward cheaper metal blends. So your 1978 D1 cent coin is more than just a common copper penny. It's a snapshot of American money before big changes hit, a final decade memorial cent anchored in everyday commerce, minted in massive quantities but still rich with design history, minting context, economic background, and the long legacy of the Lincoln cent series that stretches from 1909 all the way to today. Next, top 6. The 1980 D. Lincoln Memorial Cent, struck at the Denver Mint during a moment of economic tension and shifting American culture, represents one of those everyday pocket coins that quietly carries a surprisingly deep historical, political, and numismatic story behind its unassuming little copper-colored face. By 1980, the United States was standing at a crossroads. Inflation was high, confidence in the economy was shaky, and American manufacturing was struggling, which meant that even the cost of striking a penny had become a national conversation. Because of that, the 1980s were the last years when the U.S. Mint could comfortably continue producing the traditional bronze-based cents, a composition that had already been tweaked in 1974 due to rising copper prices, but fully replaced by copper-plated zinc in mid-1982. So your 1980 D penny is part of the last true copper era, made of 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc, weighing about 3.11 grams, and carrying that warm, real copper tone that collectors often prefer over the lighter, brighter zinc pieces that came after. The obverse shows Abraham Lincoln, sculpted by Victor David Brenner, whose original design dates back to 1909 when the cent was first redesigned to celebrate Lincoln's 100th birthday, making the 1980 D one of the later entries in the long, proud series of Lincoln portrait coins that have stayed practically unchanged for over a century. On this 1980 piece, you'll also spot the motto Liberty, the date 1980, and the D mint mark just below the date, indicating production at the Denver Mint in Colorado, which, by the way, was producing billions of coins annually at the time due to massive national demand for circulating coinage in retail, vending, transportation, and payroll systems. On the reverse, you've got the familiar Lincoln Memorial design by Frank Gasparo, introduced in 1959 for the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birth. If you look closely, you can see a tiny figure of Lincoln sitting inside the memorial, one of the only circulating U.S. coins to include the same person on both sides. By 1980, this design had already been in circulation for over 20 years and was immediately recognizable as part of everyday American life, showing up in piggy banks, grocery change, store counters, and school lunch boxes across the country. Denver struck an enormous number of these coins, over 4.2 billion, which means the coin was never rare, but high-quality specimens remain desirable today, especially in untouched red RD mint state condition. Because copper oxidizes easily, most circulated 1980 D cents turn brown, BN, or reddish-brown RB. So fully red, sharply struck pieces graded MS 66 or higher can bring some premium among collectors, while ordinary worn examples are still just worth 1 cent. The 1980 D also sits at a fascinating moment in U.S. mint history. It came right before a composition revolution in 1982, before the digital age transformed coin processing, before the memorial reverse was replaced in 2009, and before the price of copper soared so high that people began hoarding pre-1982 cents for their metal value. In the broader cultural setting, 1980 was a year wrapped in tension and transition. The Cold War was ongoing, the U.S. presidential election was heating up between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, inflation was biting hard, and Americans were looking for stability in familiar national imagery, Lincoln's steady profile being one of those comforting symbols. Your 1980 D penny would have entered circulation during this climate, passing through the hands of workers, store owners, bus riders, cashiers, and kids, eventually carrying the wear patterns, scratches, and toning that reflect the life it lived. From a numismatic perspective, the coin has few major errors, but varieties include minor die cracks, small die chips, filled D mint marks, and occasional off-center strikes, though none are extremely rare. Collectors often group this cent with the broader copper-era set, where it serves as a representative of late 1970s and early 1980s American monetary production. What's especially cool is that every 1980 D cent is technically worth more in copper content than its face value, though melting pennies is illegal, meaning these coins represent a little preserved piece of pre-zinc American metallurgy. Overall, the 1980 D cent stands as a quiet, hard-working piece of U.S. history. A coin from a time when American pockets were still jingling with heavy copper, when the memorial reverse was the symbol of the 1 cent denomination, and when billions of pennies quietly flowed through the nation's economic arteries, including the very one you're holding today next top 7.